That is the family courthouse where this all began back in 2016. 2016, 9 years ago. And today we are here across the street at the civil courthouse, and I'm going to wait until a lot of people get in. I want to see if people want to guess what happened. So we just did a very long live stream, and there were 18,000 people watching that. Hi, John. Nice of you to be in here. So we are back. John, can you hear my sound okay? I'm going to wait until everybody gets in, and I'm going to tell you how it went. But first I want to see what you guys think, because it's always really hard to guess what a jury is going to do. And so what we do is we work with what we know is happening along the way covering a trial. And I've tried to do that here with I've tried to do that with the live streams that we've been doing since this started. Peppy is taking a rest in the car right now. It's nice and shady, so she's getting a little bit of a break. She has, just so you guys know, movie stars, they have a thing called riders. And those are their contracts that before they perform in a movie, or if musicians in a concert, they sign a rider. So I always laugh that Peppy has a rider about her certain rest times if she's getting a little older. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning, and that is that there was a 74-year-old man involved in his second divorce in that courthouse across the street in 2016. And that's the family courthouse, and that's the year that courthouse opened to the tune of $283 million. Let's do that. Bus driver, move that bus. There's the short bus for all of those you who know those old jokes. And that's the courthouse. $283 million to build that. And just like the casinos in Lake Tahoe, that didn't get built with private donations. That got built with taxpayer money. And we are ending 9 years later in this old civil courthouse, not the pretty courthouse, which is the first civil courthouse, but this courthouse. And so both family law cases and jury trials related to attorneys that you sue for malpractice and fraud are held in civil court. And family court is considered a civil court too. This morning or this afternoon we did a hour and a half live stream from the criminal courts talking about the shenanigans going in family and criminal courts with court reporters and court clerks. So if you go back, you can look at that. 18,000 people watched that, by the way. So 9 years ago, a man named Richard wanted to get a divorce. And he went into the offices of Mark Erickson, a divorce attorney. And that same year, Mark Erickson was representing a 49er player in a DV and child custody case in that courthouse. And that was the courthouse. That was the case that I very first covered as a reporter. And it was something that I had just observed from my own personal experiences. And I didn't have child custody disputes or anything in my divorce. And I was starting to see all these minors counsel, DV claims, some false DV claims. We talked about one of those earlier today where the woman made up a false claim against her husband in order to break a prenup and a postnup. So Richard had a prenup with a woman named Mary Lopez. And Mary Lopez had been divorced. They started dating as she was being divorced. And when I tell you the background on this, I hope you help apply this to your own personal lives. Hey, Admiral Kirk, that's really interesting news. That's great. Really doing me proud right now. So Richard and Mary had a prenup. They agreed to keep their separate properties separate. Richard's children had passed away, but Mary had some children. She had some separate property, and so they wanted to protect their separate property interests. And so for any of you who are on later in life relationships, that's something that you probably hear a lot of, is about postnups and prenups and that kind of thing. So Richard had a prenup with Mary in 2002, and then they were married in 2009. I may have inadvertently before said 2007, but they were married in 2009. And then in 2014, Mary's first husband's rich uncle died. And Mary and her first husband, started working together on the estate for that rich uncle, and that included some gold coins. And Mary allegedly emptied the safe in that house and deprived the heirs of that, of those gold coins and some other property, and we will never know. Mary is still subject to a lawsuit related to that as well. So Richard walks into the offices of Mark Erickson, a divorce attorney. He is a super lawyer, and we've tried to cover that is a marketing gimmick that attorneys use to attract business. And he's also a certified family law attorney, and we talked about that also. That's when you have a specialty, much like doctors who are specializing as surgeons or as pediatricians or as general practitioners. Mark Erickson wasn't a general practitioner, he was a family law attorney. Whoever asked, are you Irish? I am very Irish, thank you for asking. So he walks into Mark Erickson's office. He says he's concerned that his wife of his separate property. And Mark Erickson says, okay, we're going to file for divorce. He didn't really want a divorce. He was thinking about more of a post-nup to protect his legal assets, but he wanted to maintain his marriage. He had lost both of his children in his life. His first wife had died. He might have been married a second time. I'm not positive about that. But he was in his mid-70s, he was lonely, and he wanted this relationship with Mary to last. So even after their divorce was filed, they continued to live together in her house, they continued to travel, and then in the background was this Almaden property that she convinced him to dump $1 million into and lend her money to buy other properties. And that's what he had hired Mark Erickson to protect. So it wasn't long after that Mark Erickson proposed a marital settlement agreement, which most people should really consider. And attorneys should be working very hard to do that. They should be getting clients to settle, keeping them out of court, and not depleting their assets. And Mark Erickson then, when Mary rejected, she hired David Patent, who is a notorious family law attorney here in Santa Clara County. And she rejected the marital settlement agreement, and so Mark Erickson tells Richard that he should hire a private judge, Michael Smith. Doesn't give him other names, doesn't tell him what private judging legally is or the ramifications and the risks, kind of like making someone take a plea deal without understanding what rights they're giving up. Just gets Richard to agree to use private judge Michael Smith. Didn't give him options, and Richard said that he went to the courthouse to find out about Michael Smith. He checked, he tried to find information online, and there was absolutely no information online about private judging. There were no lists posted, as private judges are required to do. They are required to post the lists for their cases. And so then there are a couple of meetings with Michael Smith, and then without circulating any drafts or anything else, Mary and Richard go to a settlement conference with private judge Michael Smith. And when they walk in, the attorneys go in the back into Michael Smith's office, which was dubbing as a chambers, as if it was a legitimate court. And when they emerge with a document called a term sheet. And Michael Smith then puts the term sheet in front of Richard, and Mary and David Patent go into another room. And the reason I know this in detail is because back in 2021, I met Richard, and I started following this and started following the Michael Smith hearings. And I could hear the tone, and some of them are posted way back on some of my videos. If you see, I went in after listening to one of his hearings remotely. I went into his office and asked his paralegal about private judging, and I got a very bizarre answer. So there was no information available about private judging. And so Richard goes in, and Mark Erickson allegedly sits behind him, and Michael Smith presents this document and says, Mary loves you, you should sign this. This will get all of your financial concerns out of the way, and you guys can get back to on with your lives. And the way that that was described to me was similar to the way that we hear about Catholic priests that use the trust of the church and people who are very religious. It was very similar. And people trust the courts in general, just like they trust the police, they trust the courts. And there are trustworthy people in any system, and there are untrustworthy people. And Richard is deeply religious, and so that probably played into him being able to trust easily what the lawyer he is paying to protect him to do. And so Richard signed the term sheet. Mark Erickson allegedly said nothing. And after he signed it, Richard has always asserted that Mark Erickson said, I can't believe you just signed that. Mark Erickson then spent another 6 months, 8 months, and then he filed more court documents billing Richard more and more money. Mark Erickson testified in this trial that he didn't want to pressure Richard because he didn't want to get fired. He was more worried about maintaining the income that Richard was paying him. Richard is a retired school teacher, he has a pension, and he had some real estate income properties, and he was paying Mark Erickson a fair amount of money. Not 49er money, but it was a fair amount of money. And 8 months later, Mark Erickson files a document in court and says that the term sheet that Richard signed was signed under coercion and duress and fraud, and he was trying to set it aside, and he took that motion back to the family court to Judge Greenwood, and Judge Greenwood sent it back to the private judge, because once you agree to a private judge, you don't escape that private judge unless that private judge is disqualified or recuses. And so Richard continued for about 4 years with Mark Erickson, and then finally realized that he needed another attorney. He hired another attorney, Bob Tennant, and Bob Tennant came in with Michael Smith. And one of the things, this was the hearing that I heard, where Bob Tennant, it was 2020, and Bob Tennant had been in the hospital, and he asked for a continuance, and they didn't give him a continuance. And David Patton, Mary's attorney, asked for a continuance around that same time because he was going to go on vacation for his wife's birthday, and Michael Smith gave the continuance for that. So private judges can do the same shenanigans of favoritism as public court judges can do in trials. So just keep that in the back of your mind. This goes on. Finally, Michael Smith recuses. If you remember, we had a string of people who had been placed in front of Michael Smith, including the redheaded Russian lady who I interviewed right over there. She had Judge Cindy Hendrickson, and these things should look familiar to you because I interviewed her there, and then we talked further there about the strategic domestic violence restraining order filed against her, which landed in front of Michael Smith, which is what got my attention, because Michael Smith wasn't following the law in handling those cases. And by that time, his paralegal was Margaret Russo. And what I was told she was doing in these cases was not just paralegal following the law duties, but really sounded like picking on a woman who had lost her attorney because she couldn't afford to pay for it. So Julia's case was going on at the same time as Richard's case was going on, and we start to see these patterns. And in 2021, Richard sued Mark Erickson for malpractice. It was timely, and he didn't arbitrate with Mark Erickson. They landed in court, and they didn't just land in court for malpractice. The claim was for fraud, and it was for breach of fiduciary duty, and Richard was seeking punitive damages, which could have given him, the jury, the ability to say your damages are $1.5 million on a malpractice case, but we're going to triple that, and it would have given him a great deal of money. Now, Richard is 81 years old, and there are cases where people might have been harmed far more and lost more money, but Richard funded the litigation to sue his attorney, and we don't usually see that being done. And so Richard sued in court. There were depositions. It cost about over $300,000 to bring this case to trial, and most people can't afford to sue that. So remember that when you hire a divorce attorney, you have to ask yourself, if someday you wanted to sue that attorney because they threw you under the bus and failed to protect you, would you be able to do that? And also look at your retainer agreements and see whether or not they would permit you to go to court, or if you have to go to secret arbitration. So fast forward through all years of deposition, Richard had surgeries, he had a lot of health problems, he kept fighting to get to court. And I will tell you that there is a law in most states that if you are elderly, they're supposed to expedite you through the system, but that was not done here. And so we were coming right up on that 5-year mark. We talked about that in our earlier live stream, because cases are only allowed to be pending for 5 years. And I have seen really viable cases literally get dismissed days before a jury trial because it hit the 5-year mark. And so that wasn't the case. A jury was selected. It started with Judge Pennypacker in that courtroom. She was the calendar setting judge. There was a number of procedural issues that looked problematic to me with Judge Pennypacker. We know Judge Pennypacker is not fond of Richard's attorney, because that attorney is the same attorney who represented me in a civil restraining order case involving divorce attorney Nicole Ford. And anybody who saw that, and I know a lot of people did come in and see that, you could see that Judge Pennypacker had made up her mind. She ruled against the attorney on every single incident, and it was typical of how we know the retaliation that judges can do, and they have the discretion to do that. There's no one that's going to hold them accountable for that. And so Judge Pennypacker set this case before Judge Izard, and Mark Erickson's attorneys didn't want Judge Izard because Judge Izard has a reputation of being fair, and she has issued rulings for malpractice against other attorneys in this county, including Carlos Martinez. And Carlos Martinez is a real estate attorney who doubles as a family law attorney. He's been in some of the worst cases that we've seen, several with Brad Baugh, and I know there are people that are still fighting him in probate court, and we'll get into Carlos Martinez a little bit later. And so we fast forward, and they get Judge Sabin. And the comments from the jurors and from the people who were in the courtroom was that there was an appearance that Judge Sabin was fair, she was polite, she was exactly as we would expect a judge to be. Ms. Black, you're going to have to wait until I tell everyone what the verdict is at the end, because we have to say what the case was about first. So then all of this went through the jury process. There were 2 days on, 5 days off, 2 days on, a week off for Bruce McLeod, Mark Erickson's attorney, to go on vacation. And then they came back yesterday. They finished closing arguments, and then the jury, they finished up this morning, and the jury went in to deliberate right before lunch. And that's when you start to guess how long a jury is going to come back. And when it's really clear, the jury, of which way the decision is going to go, we usually see juries come back right away. And the jury did call for a question. They called for a question related to Mark Erickson's client, who is Richard, his expert. His expert was out of Sonoma County, and he is a very expensive expert. I don't have the exact number, but I think he cost over $35,000 or $40,000. And the job of an expert is to be the evidence for the jury to be able to make their decision. And so they were calling specifically for his testimony. They wanted to know what he had testified about the standard of care. Because if the standard of care says that an attorney falls below the standard of care, then they are negligent and they can be held responsible for malpractice. So when the jury calls for a question, that can go either way. Either they're looking for the evidence to be able to rule in favor of the client, or they're looking to make sure there is no evidence so they can rule in favor of the divorce attorney. And so everything that the public and the jury saw was appearing fair, other than the drawn out court proceedings. And then, but what we saw in the background, and I talked about this in my live stream, and that's the dirty little things that happen out of the eye of the jury. And the number one thing was the motion in limine. And the motions in limine, when you guys are watching court videos or listening about court, you need to understand the importance of motions in limine. A motion in limine is when somebody asks a judge to exclude certain information. And that usually is like playing a poker game and showing your hand, because it shows what you are most worried about. And Mark Erickson and his attorney, Brad Benning and Bruce McLeod, were most worried about the jury hearing anything about private judging. And the judge granted their motion in limine and prohibited the jury from hearing anything about private judging. And for anybody who has watched this channel since 2019, you know 90% of what I talk about is the insidious parts of private judging. They aren't following the law, they aren't following the rules, and when you all hear about private judging, you're all outraged. But the jury was deprived hearing anything about private judging. And this was a case that was about private judging. And the attorney for Richard was not allowed to say anything about private judging. There were other motions in limine to throw out causes of action, including fraud, including punitive damages, and including breaches of fiduciary duty. And the judge granted all of those motions. And other attorneys that I spoke to, hi Rick in Los Gatos, California, I appreciate it. Yeah, if everyone puts where they're from, that would be really helpful, because I want to know who is locally watching this, because these are the judges and the attorneys in California that affect your lives. But if I can get more information, even if hyper local, if you're in Santa Clara County, you don't need to say this city, but if you're in Santa Clara, San Mateo, Contra Costa, anywhere in Northern California or even Southern California where private judging is out of control, in Orange County, because that's where it all got started. Thank you, East Coast, and Concord, New Hampshire. We do have a Concord, California. And so I appreciate knowing, because I want to know if you know about private judging, if you've ever been affected by it. Okay, so that's the setup. The jury went into deliberations before lunch. I was pretty certain they would not come back before lunch, just because of how this process works. Once the jury reaches their decision, they call in the court reporter, they call back the attorneys, they call back the parties, and everybody is in the courtroom for the jury to render their decision. And sometimes the attorneys want to talk to the parties and or to the jury, and they want to find out why they ruled a certain way. So when I arrived from the criminal court, because I was across town doing the live stream earlier, and when I arrived at the criminal courthouse, what I did is within seconds, I parked right here on the street. Puppy's taking her little nap in there. And I saw Mark Erickson leave the courthouse alone without his attorney. And he saw me, and he went right back into the courthouse. And he was leaving the courthouse as if he was a little bit wanting to get out of there faster than you can imagine. And so you start thinking about, well, did he want to get out of there because he lost? Did he want to avoid my camera? Why did he want to get out of there? So now I have set the stage. I have done hours of live streams. I've posted documents. I've tried to explain this to you, because this is the first ever private judge related malpractice fraud case that I have ever seen in the state of California against an attorney. And malpractice cases alone are very difficult, rarely done, and very costly. So whoever said I'm a victim of private judging, my email is gilroybassi@gmail.com. You can feel free to email me. I told everybody earlier, make a Proton account if you don't want to use your regular email and you want to contact me confidentially. Okay, so that's where we are. I gave you the setup. I did the live stream. It was like waiting for a baby to be born, and we were all waiting in the waiting room together. So anybody want to give me their guesses on whether or not the Mark Erickson's former client won this case or not? I want to see what your guesses are. My battery's going low, so you better guess quickly, because I'm going to say. So one person says guilty. Guilty would mean that Mark Erickson would have to pay his client over $1.5 million. It would all come out of his insurance, so it's not that big of a deal. I hear another winner. That's 2. Anyone else want to take a guess? Guilty, yes, yes. The former client lost today. Mark Erickson won, and he got away with what he did. And the jury rendered that decision. I chased the jurors down the street to ask if they wanted to talk about it, and most of them said they did not want to discuss it. And so that is how it goes. This will likely embolden the divorce attorneys, who will feel like they won't be sued for malpractice, even when they do outrageous things. But most importantly, that jury sent a win to private judging. And the case, in my opinion, having covered these cases for as long as I have, the case was lost the moment that Judge Sabin ruled that the jurors couldn't hear anything about private judging. That was the moment the case was lost, and that was the first day. And they quoted my articles and my reporting and the reporting that was done in the Daily Journal. And so the former client, who is 81 years old, is of course devastated. This is a win not just for divorce attorneys and private judges who are attorneys themselves, but it's also a win for Richard's former wife, who's going to feel a little more emboldened in their settlement. And that is one of the reasons why going to a jury is very risky. That was a $350,000 gamble. Whoever says blah, 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 probably you shouldn't be on this platform. So I don't think there's ever been anybody reporting on a civil case like this. It's not a super exciting case. It's not a murder case. It's not a kidnapping or anything else. But this is how out of control divorce attorneys and insurance companies are in the state of California, and private judging is spreading across the country. So whoever said another win for corruption, that's absolutely true. The fact that there's flagrant violations of the law, the state bar isn't doing anything about these attorneys. The fact that attorneys are becoming private judges without being elected or appointed to the bench or having any judicial training is really quite a problem. And so we're going to continue to report on it. We're going to continue to report on the lack of, Schultz fired. How about you get off this platform, okay? If you don't want to hear what we're talking about here, there are a million other places you can be. There were a lot of people that were interested in this, and you don't need to make nasty comments. And I'm going to get some moderators in here in the future, and they're going to knock people that make nasty comments out. This is about attorneys, and attorneys need to be watchdog just like police officers do. Robert Mandel, if you don't know what private judging is, you need to start back in my videos in 2019. But basically, a private judge is a rent-a-judge, a temporary judge, a fake judge. It's just an attorney playing judge for money and for pay. So it's been 9 years since Richard walked into Mark Erickson's office. This litigation with his wife and with Mark Erickson has probably cost him $1 million. And all he wanted was protection from a gold digger like wife. And that's what divorce attorneys are doing and are capable of doing. And so I'm going to remind you all, don't hire an attorney. And if you do, try to stay out of court, because this is where you could end up. 9 years later, and Richard is 81 years old. So that's where we are. And thank you everybody who's come in for all the lives and watched it. You got to see it just right when I did. I've tried to take you along. Whoever just said that, Chad Crum, you're funny. My opinion was this case was over the moment that Judge Sabin ruled favorably for Mark Erickson on that motion in limine. So we're going to continue to do this kind of reporting. I'm next going down to Orange County, and I think that private judging is something that the state legislature needs to address because too many people are losing too much money. And I just want you to realize that it shouldn't cost anybody $1 million for a divorce. It just shouldn't. If you're charged with murder, most people don't pay $1 million for that. So why should you pay that for a divorce? This is bankrupting too many middle-class families, and it is out of control. And the gatekeepers of all of this are the public court judges in these civil courthouses and in this family courthouse. And remember the story that I told you at the beginning of my earlier live stream about Judge Estramaria in Department 77 having his courtroom doors locked when someone was asking to have a case moved to Texas, and about Judge Hayashi and what she is doing in the case involving Lindley Hogan, where somebody made up that there was a nonprofit and she said that wasn't material to the case. So all of these are spin-offs of judges not doing their jobs, and that has been something that has evolved over the last 10 years. So we need to start paying attention to divorce attorneys and these incompetent, complicit or corrupt judges, just as we do police officers, because sometimes they're doing more damage to us than bad cops are. So thank you, everybody. That was a lot of live streaming. I've been live streaming for 2 hours today. I've had to improvise a lot of that. I've done the work, and I'm going to keep doing the work until private judging and minors counsel are shut down. Thank you, guys.